My father passed away some time ago, and naturally, his absence was deeply felt in our lives. My wife and I began to think about how we could make my mother comfortable in her later years. Initially, the solution seemed simple. She would move in with us and our 2 young children, so she wouldn't feel alone and could be surrounded by family, especially with the loss of my father. But there was a significant obstacle: our small apartment. It had only 2 bedrooms, which were not enough to accommodate another person. And although we had saved some money, it wasn't enough to buy a house. Eventually, my mother decided to sell her house in Virginia. She hoped the money from the sale would be enough to allow us to buy a home in Maryland, where she could spend the rest of her days close to us. She was adamant that this was the best solution, as she preferred for us to use the money to buy a house rather than pay for a nursing home, which she would never have accepted. But another problem arose. My mother's house was filled with so many things that needed to be moved and cleaned before it could be sold. I had a feeling the task would be overwhelming. So, one day I decided to go back to the house myself and start the work. I began on the first floor, then moved to the second, and finally reached the attic. When I entered the attic, I was surprised by what I found. The attic was filled with family memories, like a time capsule waiting to be opened. There were photo albums of our vacations in Hawaii, childhood photos, graduation pictures, and even a collection of Dragon Ball cards that I thought I had lost years ago. But among all those memories, there was also a folder containing important documents: my parents' marriage certificate, birth certificates, and death certificates. As I went through these documents, I realized something strange. The last name I had carried my entire life wasn't my real last name. I remembered that my parents had changed our family name when I was very young, so it wasn't completely unusual that I didn't remember it. But, as you can imagine, curiosity got the best of me. Why did they change the name? Was there something they were hiding? Were we running from something? I wondered a lot, and decided to confront my mother about it. It was a difficult decision, but I had been thinking about it for a while. After the kids went to school, and I knew my wife was at work, I saw the opportunity to sit down with my mom and talk. I sat next to her in the living room while she was watching TV. I was a bit nervous, but I gently told her I needed to discuss something with her. I pulled out the documents I had found and showed them to her, asking her about the change in her last name. I expected a surprised or perhaps an excited reaction, but instead, my mother seemed resigned. She had already known that I would eventually find those papers. This wasn't the house I grew up in. It was a house they had lived in for years, so she expected I would come across something like this. Over time, it seemed like she knew that this day would eventually come. Then, my mother revealed something I had never heard of before. We had an uncle I had never known about. He passed away when I was still a young child. It was a difficult moment for me, especially since no one had ever told me about him. But I began to understand that my mom must have had her reasons for keeping this all a secret. I waited patiently for her to explain everything. But the truth was more complicated than I had imagined. There was a real reason behind the name change, and it involved a family scandal. It turned out that my uncle's death had caused a real scandal, and in order to avoid the wrath of reporters and the media, my parents decided to change our last name and move to a new place to start over. I think my mother didn't want to tell me the full truth, and it felt like I was watching her struggle with a huge internal dilemma when she first spoke to me about it. I knew her well enough to see that she was trying to avoid the most important part of the story. So, I eventually asked her directly to tell me the whole story. After a brief hesitation, she finally relented, and here is what she told me in short. Apparently, my uncle met my future aunt in college. They had a somewhat unstable relationship, and my father knew that there was a good chance it would end badly. But suddenly, they stopped the gossip and announced their engagement. My father thought it was only a matter of time before everything blew up, so he didn't expect much from the marriage. However, as the wedding day approached, my father began to understand why my uncle was so attached to her. It turned out that my aunt's family was incredibly wealthy, with a fortune passed down over generations. They own a series of canning factories and vineyards. My mother explained that these were big businesses at the time, and in short, they were loaded with money. My father had always made it clear that marriage for financial gain wasn't ideal, but my uncle didn't want to listen to that and ended up marrying her in a lavish ceremony at a beautiful estate in the countryside, attended by many important people. It seemed that the first few months of the marriage were like a fairy tale, but after that, everything returned to normal. As I told you, their relationship was extremely troubled, and they were always fighting about something. So, between the quarrels and arguments, rumors of annulment and divorce started to spread. But the couple pushed on, and my uncle became so accustomed to this lifestyle that he couldn't let it go. However, after some time, an accident changed everything. In their first year of marriage, my uncle and aunt went on a hiking trip in the mountains, and it seems that my aunt fell badly. My uncle rushed her to the hospital, and although she was seriously injured, the doctors managed to save her life. However, after the surgery, the family received the devastating news that she would never walk again and was unlikely to regain the use of her arms. As I told you, this tragedy changed everything in their lives. At first, it was just a complication due to my aunt's condition, and after much treatment, she was able to move her right hand slightly. But after that, her family started blaming my uncle for what had happened to her. Since she was incapacitated, he took her place in the family business, which they didn't like at all, especially her older brother, who was the general manager of the company. This man had always believed that my uncle was after money and was convinced that the incident wasn't a simple accident, but that my uncle had provoked it to get rid of her. But the worst storm came later. One night, my aunt took a full bottle of sleeping pills and died from poisoning. The truth of this was a tragedy and a scandal in itself. But the real storm came when the police officer who lifted the body found a note inside her pillow, written by her own hand, confessing what had actually happened. It turned out that her brother wasn't completely wrong. She hadn't fallen off the cliff by accident. My uncle had pushed her during an argument. In that note, she confessed that she hadn't said anything because she loved him, apologized to him, and told him that he didn't do it on purpose and that he loved her too. She said that during her recovery, he had been wonderful in taking care of her and handling the family business. However, she had recently discovered that he had a mistress, and she knew that she could no longer move forward with him. As you can imagine, this caused a whirlwind, and amidst all this chaos, my uncle fled, leaving the burden of his wife's family's pressures on our family. As he fled from justice, my uncle disappeared from everyone's radar. No one heard from him again, not even my grandparents. But my aunt's family was convinced that he was responsible for everything and that they were hiding him. The scandal and the drama that followed led my parents to decide that it was best to change course. I never imagined that a simple last name could conceal such a dark history full of secrets and difficult decisions. My uncle wasn't found in Hawaii until 4 years later, when he had changed his identity and managed to stay hidden among the locals all that time. However, on the same night he was caught, he committed suicide by hanging himself with his shirt. I was completely stunned when I heard this horrific story and scolded my mother for never telling me about it. She told me they had planned to tell me when I was ready, but honestly, who decides that? In the end, they postponed it for so long that they chose to keep it a secret. They were afraid that revealing it would shatter our perception of our family and cause us unnecessary shock. I don't know how I would have dealt with carrying this secret as a young man, but as a father, I can understand why they did it. I support their decision. Sometimes you have to keep secrets. At a certain age, the truth can feel like a stab in the back or a bullet in the chest. I've seen children grow up knowing the truth too early. They become adults before their time, and that stays with them. At first, I was a little upset when I learned they had hidden all of this from us, but then I realized they only did it when we were old enough. I'm not entirely sure how to start this conversation, but perhaps it's best if I tell you how I ended up in this situation. I apologize if the story is a bit long, but I have a lot to share. The truth is, I never imagined I would find myself in this position. I was never a trained warrior or a strong person. On the contrary, my life was far removed from all of that. I don't consider myself someone with physical strength, but I was interested in a completely different world. Up until that moment, I had only touched a firearm a few times, maybe when I was playing in the backyard using baseball guns or toy guns. But I had never been in a real situation where such things were required. Like any teenager, I was obsessed with comic books and video games, which kept me occupied throughout my school years. After graduating from high school, I went to college and majored in programming, which became the profession I loved. Then, after completing my studies, I got a job at a small video game development company and lived an independent life on my own. Everything was going well until 2020. For me, it was a normal year, but for the entire world, it marked the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic that drastically changed our lives. For my family, it was the beginning of a difficult battle that would change everything. During the pandemic, my mom finally decided to divorce my stepdad after years of physical and verbal abuse that worsened during the lockdown. My mom had to take care of herself and my younger brother, who was 12 years old. My mom was always strong, and despite all the hardships she had been through, she managed things wisely. But with places closed due to the pandemic, she lost her job, and that was a huge blow for everyone. As soon as I heard about this, I didn't hesitate to leave my apartment and move in with them. I sold everything I could and put the rest of my things in storage because I couldn't leave my family out on the street under those circumstances. The pandemic was a mixed experience for us. I became the breadwinner because I was working remotely, and my income was mainly from my online work. But we still couldn't secure all our needs, and we had to struggle. Fortunately, my mom enjoyed selling old things online, so she started selling some of her belongings on sites like eBay and Etsy. That helped us stay in a better financial situation than we were before. But still, the bigger problem remained. My stepdad, despite the divorce, didn't stop interfering in our lives. I encouraged my mom to get a restraining order against him, but she still allowed him to see my brother. As for me, I would have preferred to stop everything, but I knew it wasn't fair to prevent my brother from seeing his father as long as he kept his calm. So, I decided to stay out of the issue and avoid any confrontations. Luckily, the lockdowns ended the following year, and our lives slowly started to return to normal. I went back to the office, and my brother returned to school. At the same time, my mom started finding part-time work at a bar in the downtown area. The situation wasn't ideal, but it was better than before. However, that wasn't the end of the problems. My stepdad found out where my mom was working and began showing up at the bar regularly, causing trouble. My mom tried to put up with him, especially when he was drinking, but that night, something unexpected happened. My stepdad crossed all boundaries and threw a beer glass in my mom's face. Fortunately, some customers at the bar intervened and kicked him out, but things didn't end there. The next day, my stepdad was in a furious rage, standing in front of our apartment, and began beating my mom mercilessly. I was out of the house at that time, busy with work, and you can't imagine how much I regretted not being there. When I returned home, the first thing I saw was my mom's face, full of bruises, and that was more than just a shock to me. I was incredibly angry and decided that I would not let this man get away with these actions without consequences. I told my mom firmly that if the police didn't take decisive action, I would handle it myself. My mom looked scared, but she asked me to listen to her. Despite my anger, I decided to listen to her. While we were talking, my mom reminded me that we had called the police several times before, but he always escaped punishment. Instead of continuing in this endless cycle, my mom suggested that we move somewhere else, where it would be harder for him to harass us. I thought about it for a while and didn't find the idea bad. Our life in the neighborhood had deteriorated after the pandemic, and moving somewhere else could be a fresh start for all of us. So, we decided to start preparing for the move. That night, while we were packing our things, I noticed my mom putting her father's old gun in her bag. I looked at her in surprise, but she quickly closed it and went back to her work. I didn't comment on it, though I thought that having it might be necessary if my stepdad showed up again. The next morning, we began to leave, avoiding telling anyone what we were doing, even the landlord. We traveled all day, only stopping for a quick snack. In the evening, we decided to rent a room for the night, and while having dinner, my mom received a text message from my stepdad. She read the message in shock and said to me, "Did you really think I'd let you escape like this with my son?" I took the phone from her and read the message out loud. In an instant, we ran toward the window to check what was happening outside. My stepdad had already seen us and started running toward us. The moments passed in eerie silence. I felt my heart racing as his voice grew closer. He began banging on the door violently, and I felt the nerves creeping through my body. Over time, the knock stopped, but we didn't have time to celebrate. In an instant, the door came off its hinges and my stepdad opened it violently. We all rushed to escape, but it was too late. He had grabbed my mom and started beating her mercilessly. I felt helpless. At that moment, this monster was much bigger than me. But I had no choice but to act to save my mom. I ran to my mom's bag and grabbed the gun. In 3 quick movements, I pulled the trigger, and the horrific sound silenced in my ears. When my stepdad stopped, he stared at me in shock. He quickly staggered out, and I ran toward my mom, who was lying on the floor, unconscious, as if life had left her. Despite feeling guilty and worried, I called emergency services, and my mom was taken to the hospital. After several hours, the police told me that my actions were considered self-defense. This was the event that changed my life forever. You may have heard stories about cruel stepmothers mistreating their stepchildren in horrific ways, but in my case, it was nothing like that. My situation was entirely different. My mother was the monster in my life. From a very young age, I realized that I needed to escape from home because the abuse I was enduring was so intense that I couldn't stay there for even one more second. So one day, I took a handful of jewelry I had stolen from my mother's safe and left the house. I had no plan other than to sell the jewelry and give myself a chance to start over wherever and however I could, but away from the hell I was living in at home. I had a feeling my mother would send someone after me, but not because she cared at all, but because I was just her scapegoat. The truth was, I was born to be her emotional punching bag, a person she could unleash all her anger and frustrations on in the harshest possible ways. My birth was not a happy moment for her. It was a constant reminder that she married my father only for money, without any love involved. I don't know why my father tolerated the relationship for so many years and never left her, because even as a young child, I felt the tension between them. My mother never hesitated to make it clear to me that I was just my father's daughter, someone she utterly despised. And so, by extension, I was despised too. I remember that whenever my father did something that upset her, she would take her revenge on me. She would beat me, punish me for no reason, and humiliate me in horrific ways. She always poured all her anger on me rather than confront him. I endured all this torment for 15 years, hoping that at some point she would realize that I wasn't just my father's daughter, but also shared his blood. But things never got better. So one day, I decided I had had enough. One night, after I had fallen asleep, I hid the keys to her safe, and with my heart pounding, I gathered my courage, stole the money and jewelry from the safe, and ran away. The first thing I did was take the jewelry to a pawn shop not far from my house. As soon as I left the shop, I put the money in my bag and took the subway to the other side of the city. I didn't know anyone, but I managed to stay in a homeless shelter for a year. During that time, I lived off the money I made from the jewelry, which of course was much less than its actual worth. As you can imagine, I dropped out of school, but I met some people who were incredibly supportive, and somehow they became my family and protected me during my time on the streets. Among them was Salma, another girl who had run away from home to escape the abuse of her adoptive parents. But that's another story. The truth was she had just turned 18, and because of that, we were able to rent a small annex together in a modest neighborhood. I also got a job at a grocery store and started earning some money. There was a Starbucks cafe right across the street, so whenever I had the chance, I would sneak outside and watch what was happening there. One day, while I was waiting for the store to open because I had arrived a little early, I saw a tall man with dark hair and a body I couldn't stop staring at. He must have been at least twice my age, but something about him completely captivated me. I stood there like a fool, staring at him until he turned around and our eyes met. His smile made my stomach flutter. Then I realized I was falling for one of the baristas. That was the first time I had ever felt this way about a man, so I decided to see him again. I was so interested in this man that I started adjusting my schedule to fit his. I also began arriving before the cafe opened just to wait for him. Before I knew it, this little routine had become the most exciting part of my day. He would always smile at me, and those moments filled me with joy. It was as if every smile he gave me wiped away a little bit of the darkness I had always carried in my life. It was like a spark of hope began to shine for the first time amid all the chaos that had been my life up until that point. Every day, I looked forward to that little encounter and dreamed of what it could become. But one day, while I was sitting there dreaming, waiting to see that barista who had stolen my heart, I suddenly noticed that it wasn't him entering the cafe, but another man. At first, I thought maybe he had overslept or something, so I decided to wait a little longer, giving him a chance. But after some time, he still didn't show up. Later that afternoon, while I was behind the counter serving customers, I saw him again, but this time, he was flirting with a woman. For some reason, he looked familiar, but I couldn't get a good look at his face. Suddenly, I noticed that they were getting closer and closer, and as they did, I started feeling a growing sense of anxiety in my chest. That's when I bitterly realized who the woman was and why she looked so familiar. It was my mother, and now she was passionately kissing the man I had fallen in love with in the middle of the street. In that moment, I felt like my heart was literally breaking. I felt my chest tighten with a mix of jealousy, anger, and the overwhelming urge to tear apart the face of that vile, wicked woman who had brought me into the world only to make my life miserable. When I saw them kissing like that in front of my tent, a deep rage surged inside me, as if all the years of abuse and mistreatment I had endured rushed into my stomach and began to burn along with the anger of knowing I was stealing the love of the guy I had dreamed about every night. But if they thought it was just a cruel coincidence, they were wrong. When his lips pulled away from hers, she turned to look directly at me, and our eyes met for the first time in over a year. Her eyes glowed with a hatred I had never imagined, while mine were filled with bitterness. She then looked back at him, grabbed his hair, and kissed him again as my world crumbled around her. She knew I loved him, and what she was doing was a warning. I couldn't have anything because she would take it from me. The anger I felt in that moment was indescribable. Maybe I should have let that moment pass, but I couldn't. The next day, things got worse. While I was on shift at the store, I saw my mother in the cafe wearing a short dress, flirting with the barista. The guy came out from behind the counter and sat down with her at a table, and he looked extremely seductive. That image filled me with intense anger, as if something inside me had snapped. I was blinded by rage and decided to do something about it. So, like a machine, I walked straight to the hardware section, grabbed a wrench, and headed to the cafe, hiding the tool behind my back. She was so immersed in flirting with a man that she didn't notice me at first, but with every step I took, my anger grew more intense until I finally snapped. With all the strength I had, I struck her on the head with the tool. I remember hearing a lot of screaming everywhere, but none of it mattered at that moment. I let myself surrender to the rage and kept hitting her again and again until I finally felt her go limp. I'm not sure how much time passed, but by the time someone pulled me away, her body was lying on the ground, her long dark hair covering her face, and a large pool of blood had formed around her. It wasn't until then that I barely became aware of what I had done. I could feel the tears and shame building in my eyes as I looked around at the people around me. It got worse when I realized that the barista was the one who had pulled me away from her and stopped me from hitting her anymore. Suddenly, he ran toward her and threw himself on top of her, crying and screaming. Then he looked at me, his eyes filled with so much hatred that it almost shattered my soul. But on the other hand, I felt liberated because I had rid myself of the monster who had destroyed my life. After a while, I heard the sound of police sirens approaching, and within moments, my mother was taken to the hospital. Fortunately, she didn't die from my attack, but it was a close call. It was almost a miracle that she survived. As they say, weeds never die. When I confessed to what I had done, the investigator looked at me with an expression of disbelief, and I think I had never dealt with such a situation before. Still, who knows? Sometimes people hide their truth behind a mask. After a while, my mother fully recovered from her injuries and didn't file a complaint against me. Maybe because she didn't want me to expose her true nature in front of her high society friends who thought she was a saint. She preferred to leave me as a troubled daughter who attacked her in the midst of some drug crisis or something like that. In the end, it was always about her, but I no longer cared. I never returned home after that, and I never will. I still live with my friend Salma, but now in another city where I resumed my studies and began therapy, hoping to start healing.